This tutorial demonstrates how to use the Digi-Art Quick Tool perspective path that can be found on my website and can be used to create perspective grids for drawing buildings, background scenes, cityscapes, or what have you. Once you've downloaded the perspective path and open it in Photoshop, all it says is go to your paths palette. This might seem slightly confusing at first, but just look in the same palette that has your layers, channels, and your paths, and then you'll see once you click on the perspective path that's in the paths palette, you'll see what the goal of this file is. Basically just a way to deliver to you this perspective path. So nothing pertinent in the layers, just in the paths palette. Here is basically just a dot with a bunch of lines radiating out from it. This is to simulate a single point of perspective, and I'll show you how to use that in just a moment. The other file I have on my screen is a perspective example that I created for this exercise. It's just a roughed-in cityscape that has 3-point perspective, and it's all eyeballed. This was just sketched by me real fast, but this is a good place to start where you then would need some definitive perspective to start creating the final drawing. So once you have them both open on your screen, go back to your perspective file and grab a hold of the actual perspective path in the paths palette and just drag it over to the other file. Once you position the perspective path where you want it to go, and you can tell basically that the perspective lines in the path are matching up with the lines that you've sketched in, then go back to your layers palette, create a new layer. Here I'm calling it left perspective. Set it to multiply mode, and this is so that the lines that you create on this layer you'll be able to see through. I always keep my perspective above the rest of the image. This way none of the perspective lines will be blocked out from your view by any elements that you might create that are on layers above it. Setting it to multiply will just allow you to see through the lines that we create here. And I set the foreground color that I'm going to use to stroke the path to a blue. You can use any color you want, whatever's to your liking. And then set the brush size to 1 pixel. That way the lines are apparent, but they're pretty thin. And then go to your paths palette, and in the side drop down, go to stroke path. When you're stroking your path, you can use different options, but here we're using the brush tool. And make sure that simulate pressure is turned off. And then hit OK. And now Photoshop is stroking the perspective path. But once you are no longer on the perspective path, you can see that in the layers palette, it has stroked the lines on this new layer. So that's your perspective lines coming from the left in this case. And since this is a 3-point perspective drawing, next we need the perspective lines from the right hand side. So I'm just repeating the steps here. So we're taking the perspective path and we're moving it over to the right hand side this time, and again matching the lines of the perspective path up to what I've sketched in for this city scene. Okay, and then we want to pick a different foreground color. That way we are stroking the path from this other perspective point in a different color. It just helps, at least for me, it helps me to keep track of the different directions of perspective. In this case, I'm choosing a bright red color. I'm still stroking the path like I did previously, but this time in red. Now we have our perspective lines from that side done. And since this is a 3-point perspective, let's do it a third time for the top. Now we're getting the perspective path into position for the perspective lines coming from the top, and once we get that where it needs to go, then pick a new foreground color. This time I chose green just because it will stand out from the other 2 perspective points. Call it top perspective. Set it to multiply as well. And then we're back to the paths palette to stroke this path. With green though, this time. Just now we've created a 3-point perspective grid in a layer group in Photoshop. For this scene from this point on, you would draw it in Photoshop like you normally would, but this just saves you the time or the effort of setting this up manually. Drawing individual lines for your perspective grid can be very tedious, and that's what prompted me to create this perspective path, because it was so tedious. I was doing it the hard way in Photoshop initially. Here the last thing that I do is to highlight all the different perspective layers, add them to a group called perspective, just to keep them in a nice orderly folder, so to speak. This concludes the tutorial on the Digi-Art Quick Tool Perspective Path. Please visit my website, freddyart.com, for additional Digi-Art Quick Tools and additional tutorials as well.